Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, the Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, and this is an opportunity to be together with you. The center is sponsored by Small Church Connections, and we provide a podcast, which we call This Is Us, Canadian Small Churches in Action. Well, today we get to hear about one of those small churches in action in a little place called Hamilton, Ontario. It puts us in a whole different situation, but let's find out a little bit about small churches. And I'm going to let her introduce herself and just tell us a little bit about her ministry journey and coming into and how why don't you just start, Debbie?
Okay, hello.
Hello.
It's nice to be here, Ron. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Debbie Iversen, and I am pastor of Little Bethel Community Church in Hamilton. And we're a very small congregation of about 35 members. And a bit about myself.
Mm-hmm.
I was brought up in a Christian home with a mom who had a very strong faith, a very practical faith. And that spoke volumes to me. And I also grew up in a Pentecostal church.
Good.
What I love about the Pentecostal church is God is tangible.
Mm-hmm.
And as a young person, you need to see when you pray, your prayers are answered. And just there's this emphasis on, God is here and real. And not that it's not like that in other churches, but and that spoke volumes to me. And that really built my faith up. And then that church was also a very healthy church. I realized later on in my life, where people had the opportunity to grow spiritually, but also as a person. And in terms of doing other, participating in worship. And our Pastor Tapley, was wonderful. He really brought the word alive. And I remember as a small child listening to him and just taking it all in. And so those are some of the foundational parts that have really been the structure in which God has worked.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to university. And I met Buff Cox, who was the staff worker there, a wonderfully vibrant person for God. And through her, I was able to continue to do some leadership within there. And one of the things that happened is I went to Lithuania with a short-term mission group.
Mm-hmm.
And we went there for 3 weeks. And then I had graduated after that. And then she had asked if I would be the team leader of a small team to go back for a year. So it's a really interesting story because when she had asked me that, so as you can see, I'm Black and Lithuania is in the former Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, the wall had just fallen. So they had never really seen a live Black person. So, I remember I'd be walking and then someone would be pouring something out and they'd see me and they'd just be like in awe, like, what is that? So when Buff had asked me a year later to go back for a year, I had these butterflies in my stomach and I was like, oh, I don't know. And then I said, while I was talking to her on the phone, I said in my head, God, if you want me to go, take this feeling away. Mm-hmm. And before I finished that prayer, that feeling went away and I never had it again. And so I said, okay, that's very clear. And so I went for a year and it was an incredible experience of leadership, of also getting to know God in a different way too. When you're in another culture, you reflect more on your own culture, right? And that year, I didn't know at that time, I met my future husband. He was Belgian. He is Belgian, and he was there in Lithuania doing some work with the university. And he wasn't a Christian actually, but he started coming to our group, and we were told no duck hunting, which meant, don't look for partners because you are in a different culture, things seem
Oh,
differently. So my mind was not on that at all. But then it came back to, um,
okay. This story is getting better and better. Duck hunting. Okay.
so when I came back to Canada, I went to Divinity College, and I
Mhm.
did a 3-year degree in a Master's of Religious Education.
Ah,
And then at the end of that, when I returned from Lithuania, Stephen, who's now my husband, we kept in touch via email and phone calls. It was way back when, so email wasn't a big thing, but we had started on email and phone calls. And then in '96, he had come to Canada, and we were going to visit my aunt all the way in BC. And we knew different people from InterVarsity all along the way. So we would drive from one house to the next. And by the end of that trip, he had also become a Christian by that
mhm.
point.
Yeah.
And much to his credit, I've always admired this about my husband. We were always soulmates. We could always laugh and talk. But he was with our group when for the year I was in Lithuania. And at the end, there was the opportunity to go to the camp. And
Mhm.
there was another short-term mission group from our university who came, and there was an opportunity to become a Christian. And we all thought, oh yeah, for sure,
Sure. Yeah.
and he didn't. So I asked him afterward, I said, oh, why didn't you? And he said, I could see myself being a Christian here in Lithuania, but I know when I go back to Belgium, I won't be able to. And
Mm.
I had so much admiration for him because I thought he's someone who has counted the cost of
Yeah.
being a Christian. And so that always, like, I still get moved when I tell that story.
Mhm.
And so, anyways, he became a Christian, and that was after a few years. He went back to Lithuania, and he had seen someone who was a Lithuanian and academic, and he had become a Christian the same time that Stephen had chosen not to. And when he went back a few years, he had seen how this young man had grown and just
Mm.
blossomed so beautifully. And he said, that's what I want. And then at that point, he became a Christian. And so a year later, when he came to Canada, yeah, our relationship started.
Yeah.
And then I had graduated from Divinity College. We went to Belgium, and we lived there for 17 years.
Mm.
We always worked closely with a church. But for me, ministry is not just within the church, it's with every interaction I have. And I was a Protestant teacher in Belgium, and the students, my classes were small,
Mhm.
but it was a real ministry opportunity because those young people, you got to just help them with where they were in their faith to go a bit further. And so the lessons were also tailored to them and where they were, but it was real discipleship, one-on-one
Yeah. Yeah.
discipleship. So it was really wonderful. And I also did a bit of anti-bullying in the schools. So when we came back
Mm.
to Canada 17 years later, I had actually thought I was going to work with the school systems here with anti-bullying, but nothing worked out. And then we were at Little Bethel, and I got the opportunity to Karen Lowe, pastor, Reverend Karen Lowe was the pastor here, and she had adopted 2 children with her husband. And there was the opportunity to apply to be the interim pastor, which I became. And then when Karen came back, she wanted to do co-pastoring. And then it was just a full-time job with the kids. And she was also working at CBOQ head office. And so I had to laugh because I thought I would never have applied for a position as a solo pastor, but I felt like God went in the back door, and
Yeah,
and it's been a wonderful journey since then. It's been 5 years now. Yeah.
5 years already. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Okay, so you're in a church that you call Little Bethel Community Church. Um, I have some sense of what the name might mean, but maybe you can explain a little bit of that name and how it works with community and outreach and just all sorts of stuff. Just
Okay, sure. So the church, I think in the 1980s, the name was changed. It was originally Bethel Baptist Church.
okay.
And I think, if you had a good experience with the Baptists, that was a good name, right? But I think for a lot of people, not really knowing who Baptists were or what that meant, that sometimes kept people outside.
Mm.
And so I think they changed the name to Little Bethel Community Church, um, making it very relevant and
Yeah.
approachable for the people in the neighborhood. And so, as you know, Bethel is means house of
House
God.
of God. Yeah.
And so that is really important because it's where you come to meet God, where hopefully when you enter into these doors, you experience God in some way and you're able to hear God's voice speaking. And little,
Oh, yeah.
because in Hamilton, there is a church called Bethel. It's a Pentecostal church, but it's a huge
Oh,
church.
okay.
And when we call, they always think, "Oh, you're Bethel. Oh, yes, yeah, yeah." And no, we're Little Bethel. And so that's kind of why we chose the name Little. We added a little to it. So yeah.
We built a go-kart once, and my parents told me you can't build a go-kart in one day because Rome wasn't built in one day, so we named it Little Rome. Okay, it works. Words are important. There's no question about it. So like, how does a small church survive and thrive? You're in an urban setting. I mean, it's not a small area.
Yeah, yeah. I think the number one thing for urban churches is relationships.
Mm.
And I think small churches, uh, you know, are that's their strength,
Yeah.
is relationships, because the church is small enough to know everyone. And that's what I loved. Before COVID, I knew we used to have our break in the middle of the service. So we'd have a worship time, announcements, prayer, and then we'd have a break and we'd have coffee and tea, and then we'd continue with the message. And that gave us an opportunity. People don't run
Oh,
away.
yeah.
So it gave us an opportunity, like I could touch base with each person that came, follow up with them from week to week. And so relationships in a small church are easy to build. The other side of that coin is healthy
Yeah.
relationships,
Yeah.
healthy dynamics. And I think part of my experience of being an anti-bully coordinator in Belgium was exactly that. As Christians, if we are not healthy, we only attract unhealthy people. And
Mm-hmm.
we say, "Come as you are, you can actually stay." And that Christ doesn't really care about that aspect. But it's a lie. It's not the truth. And you do a great injustice to the gospel of Christ when you do not create a healthy environment. And I think as a pastor, that has to be a number one priority in the church, that it's not the loudest voice that is only heard or has a voice, but it's everyone's voice, and it's respecting that, and it's a real retraining in sometimes in terms of the congregation and the people that come. But it's a worthwhile investment, because you will also attract healthy people, and people who are not Christians who are healthy can see right away when a church is unhealthy in its
Mhm.
dynamics. So a healthy church that is built on relationship is wonderful for a city, because in a city you kind of lose that personal connection. You kind of you're just not always
Yeah.
seen or
Mhm.
heard. And I had a congregant who always, he was an older man, and because we would talk every week, he says, it's nice to be seen. So even within the church, people need to be seen and heard, and a small church provides the opportunity to do that.
Yeah. Well, you've started talking a little bit about your gathering times, particularly Sunday, and interactive together. Any suggestions you might give for pastors of small churches as to things
Mm-hmm.
that they can do to increase that interaction, not just on Sunday, but maybe elsewhere too?
Mm-hmm. I'll start with Sunday.
Okay.
We'll
Yeah.
move on. But God, we say this is Bethel, God, where God is, God's house. And so we want to give God the opportunity to speak. And he does, through worship, through reading the word, through the sermon. Um, but there's also, it's a two-way street sometimes. So at Little Bethel, it has way before me, it has always been interactive. And so during the service, um, I will ask questions relevant to what we're talking about to get people thinking about it. And then at the end, there's always the question of what resonated with you. What is God saying to you? And it's a small community, so people are ready to share. And then you really hear what God is doing in people's lives, and how the sermon is being applied, because sometimes I have a sermon and I think people are going to get this, and that from it.
Yeah.
And then when they tell me what they've gotten, I'm like, oh my goodness, that wasn't even on my radar. But a sermon is just that. You prepare it. Um, and you ask for God's guidance, and you just release it to the Holy Spirit, that he can do with it what he wants. And it's amazing. And so also that the interactive part helps people to digest
Hmm.
what they've heard, and even helps them to think about it and apply it in different ways and in different areas. That how we have our break in the middle is also a way of that having that interaction. Um, in other ways, I think in our church, and I think in most churches it's quite democratic. You
Yeah.
want to hear the different voices. So, if I'm not hearing from different people, and there's all kinds of reasons, sometimes it's just that someone is more introverted, so they need more time to think about it before they can say. So, you know, even preparing questions ahead of time,
Hmm.
in a meeting or so, or when you're coming together and you want input, preparing the questions ahead of time really help introverts to be able to quickly put up their hand and
Yeah.
say, or if you're not able to prepare the question ahead of time, give a moment of silence for people to think about it, and then that also increases interaction in those moments. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That, okay. So currently, we've just come through, and we're not through. I'll call it the interruption or
Yes.
COVID or pandemic or whatever term you want to use. How are you dealing with that? I know in Ontario that's been a back and forth. Every day you can pretty well tune into something new. How are you guys dealing with that and with helping a community that needs, well, that needs help, needs support?
Yeah. For our church, in the beginning, it was calling people and really trying to stay connected. And so, as a pastor, you can't do that all on your own. So, trying to get different people to also call each other. And we had our services on YouTube. We were streaming live, which I really don't encourage. And after a while, we changed it to pre-recorded, and then we got a quite professional with that. But that's also not for everyone. A lot of people have especially in our congregation, they don't, because we're so interactive, that element was lost. So we had a fellowship time afterwards. Um, and it's really, again, it's just the relationships, trying to stay connected, because I think that's what COVID has really done. It's really worn us down in our isolation. And so we've tried to do what we did this last summer was we had services outside in our backyard, and it's right along the pipeline trail. So we've had a few people join us because
Oh,
they've been passing along, and just people pass by and they see, and it's interactive and those kinds of things. So that's one way that we have really, and we're hoping to continue that, and we can move in to our building now.
mm-hmm.
So we're going to see how that goes. But in terms of our community here, during COVID, we've try to really connect with them in a few ways.
Okay.
We have our Easter and Christmas service, and so for Christmas we always have a children's service, and the service on Christmas Sunday is always interactive with a story. It's all for children with crafts, and then we have a meal afterwards. And so this year we weren't able to be in the church. So what we did was we had these packages with all the craft material, and everything was recorded. So on that Sunday they could watch, and they had all the material. So we also handed it out, those packages, to children on the street. And so just kind of, Christmas was just different
Yeah.
anyways. We also put a note in their box, telling them that we know this is a difficult time and that we are praying for them. And if they have any specific needs, they can put it into our mailbox, and we'll be sure to pray for them. No one has put any
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
requests in, but they know that we're praying for them. And even on our board outside, we've said, be courageous,
Mm.
we're trying to encourage them in different ways. And it's very interesting during COVID. I've had an opportunity to meet quite a few of our neighbors,
Oh, great.
and yeah, and just have some good discussions and feeling more connected. So, that's something we are really trying to do, is be a presence in our community.
All right. Now, maybe just, I'm not sure you can answer this, but you talked about a healthy church and what that looks like. How might you help other small church pastors to say, are we healthy? What questions do we need to be asking? What are we, what is a healthy church?
Mm, yeah. Um, a healthy church is where each person is considered equal,
Hmm.
where each person has a voice. It doesn't mean that your voice will necessarily win out, but it's being heard. And I'm trying to think of this great quote I heard. Um, I can't quote it, but I'll explain it.
Sure. A
Explain it.
paraphrase is good.
That's right. Yeah. So it talks about, when you're invited to be at the table, that is having a voice.
Mhm.
And there are three different steps, and I can't quite remember. But the sense of belonging
Yeah.
is having your voice heard, right? And so you can have a voice, but that voice might not necessarily be heard. And in a church, I think that's what God wants, is to to have the different voices heard.
Uh-huh.
And that's how he kind of leads us. It is knowing what is there and taking into account, the different things. Um, and I think that's how we truly find God's will for where do we go? What's the next step for us as a community, is having the voices heard. And I think that is the biggest test, because I know in churches, you can have people who've always been there. Um, and so by some kind
Yeah.
of osmosis, they have all the authority, and what they say goes. And if you disagree, that doesn't count. It doesn't matter. But if somebody disagrees with something, and I think it's all within the framework of knowing how to disagree. And
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
good indicator of a healthy church. Can you disagree and
Mm.
still move on and move forward? Because, the Bible says they will know us by our love. It doesn't say they'll know us by how we agree on everything.
Yeah.
No, it's about in the midst of conflict. And, we are really challenged in COVID times with vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. That can really split a church.
Oh, yeah.
And it is a difficult one, because on one hand, for some people, it's a matter of life and death, and it's a matter of health. And for others, but it's my freedom that they're looking at. And so having even any kind of conversation about that is oftentimes difficult. But how do we move forward in the midst of that? How do we still have one thing that's good is that the government of Ontario has legislation on what is possible and what's not. So we build on that as churches. But how do we work and deal with these feelings that can go quite deep, and
Oh,
still have a sense of peace,
yeah.
or a sense of how do we move forward with this? I think
You're
that's
you're you're probably asking. I'm serving as an interim pastor. You're asking one of the questions that, in the midst of this time, is probably the deepest and hardest question to work with.
mhm,
No
yeah.
question about it. And
Mhm,
I appreciate what you're saying, that we have to hear each other's voice.
mhm,
We have a diversity of people. There's no question about it. But we all need to be listening to each other.
mhm.
We could both go on and expound forever. But you know what? Our time's already up. Yeah,
Mm.
I know.
That went fast.
I'm looking. I do keep a clock in front of me here. So but yeah. So thank you very much. Oh, one last question. If you had one thing that you could say to someone who said, I want to pastor a small church in an urban setting, what one thing would you tell
Mm. Healthy relationships.
them? Okay.
Build healthy relationships.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Debbie. This has been great. We could keep on going. Maybe we'll have to do another day, but thank you once again for joining us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.